us from the Gospel of Mark, the 9th chapter, the 30th through the 37th verses. The title is, Do You Know What You're Asking? Think about what that title empowers, embodies in its asking. Do you know what you're asking? With that thought in your mind, with that thought in your heart, let me share with you how Mark told the story. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again. But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. When they came to Capernaum, when he was in the house, he asked them, what was it you were arguing about on the road today? But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was going to be the greatest of them. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and a servant of all. He took a little child and had him stand among them, and taking the child in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. The words of Mark, sharing the words of God for the children of God.
Thanks be to God.
You know, one of the things in my Bible is a little subtitle says, who is the greatest? Just this flash went by. It reminded me of those days of Muhammad Ali.
Yeah.
Who is the greatest? I am the greatest. And the people, the disciples, as they were traveling with Jesus, were arguing amongst each other. Which of us will be number one, numero uno? I ask you another question, though. Have you ever asked a question without really understanding the gist of the topic, the breadth, the width, the depth of the whole topic? Sure you have. We all have. I have. It seems, though, that the disciples struggled with understanding the whole concept of who, what, how, why Jesus was. It's such a big picture. They were having trouble getting their arms around it. In today's vernacular, they might say, oh, huge. So take it all in. Just before this event, Jesus had taken Peter, James, and John to Mount Hebron. You know the story, the Transfiguration. Following that, he tried to get up front and personal with the disciples to help them understand the truth of the kingdom, the subtleties of the kingdom, if there is such a thing as subtleties of the kingdom. You see, they spent 3 years together. Jesus was ministering to the people, but teaching them all along. And what was he teaching them? All of the things that were necessary to be the founders of the body of Christ, the church. All the steps, all the healings, all the praying. 3 years they were spending together, and yet they still couldn't grasp the bigness of the event, of that situation, of each of those situations. And as I was preparing and writing, I heard another song in my mind. It was one by Toby Keith, and I want to share with you just a couple of the verses. And he was talking with, about, and to his daughter in her early childhood. And here are the lyrics. I'm lost in her, holding that pink rod and reel, She's doing almost everything but sitting still. Talking about her ballet shoes, her training wheels, and her kitten. And she thinks we're just fishing. I say, Daddy loves you, baby, one more time. She says, I know, I think I've got a bite. And all this laughing, crying, smiling, dying here inside is what I call living. She ain't even thinking about what's really going on right now. But I guarantee this memory is a big one. She thinks we're just fishing. Yeah, she thinks we're just fishing. This ain't about fishing. The disciples spent 3 years as if Jesus had taken them fishing. But it wasn't about fishing. It was about learning. Jesus took them for 3 years to teach them about learning. He was trying to prepare them for what was coming soon, what was coming next. They left Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus was now heading on this final tour of the region of Galilee. Remember, Caesarea Philippi was on the coast, and he's working his way back around the region of Galilee, which means the Sea of Galilee. And where was he heading? Jerusalem. He was on his final tour, his final burst of ministry, his final time to teach the disciples, because it would all end for him in Jerusalem, and it would all begin for us in that same place. He must get them ready, mind and body and soul. That's what lies ahead for them, is an understanding of all the parts of them to be the best that they could be. But the disciples were still struggling. They just didn't get it. They didn't understand. The values of the kingdom of God were different than the values of the world that we live in. Different than their own experiences. We must get our course set for the here and now to understand the next and the future. We have to be like the disciples, understanding all that Jesus did, and then understanding that next step of where we are going and what we must do to accomplish what God calls us to do. We must set our course to go where others have gone, to help where others have not gone. You see, ambition is a good thing. And Jesus would never put them down for having ambition to who is to be the greatest. The truth is that no ambition is worse than too much ambition, because it is a draw on our society. And the disciples were in the process of becoming the best that they could be. And the best that they could be is what the world needed, what the kingdom needed. Whether they knew it or not, Jesus was changing the terms of it. Jesus was changing what they saw as status into service. Remember, in the 70s and 80s, there was a television sitcom. It was the longest running sitcom in the history of television, even today. The Jeffersons. And the theme song of that is what the disciples should have been humming on the road with Jesus those days. Remember the words of it? Want to get a piece of the pie? To the east side. Moving to an apartment in the sky. How well does that match? See what you think. The disciples, as they walked, should have been singing this song.
It's
first. They wanted to be greatest. They wanted to move up to the east side because that was status of success. They wanted their piece of the pie. They wanted their apartment in the sky. And what did Jesus say about that? And I go before you to prepare. You see, my Father has many mansions. They wanted to be the best that they could be. They just didn't understand what they were asking for. They were thinking worldly, earthly terms, and Jesus was encouraging kingdom, eternal terms. Jesus tried to make it even more clear. They're there in Galilee, and Jesus takes the child, Simon Peter's child, to the center of the room, and the disciples are all around. And then he takes this child in his arms and told them, whoever welcomes one of these little children welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Why a child? Why a child as a lesson to the disciples to help them become the best of the best? It is because in their society, the children were the least of the least. They had no presence. They had no voice. And to Jesus, they represented everyone that had no voice. In Greek, there are two words that mean almost the same, sound almost the same. One that Jesus used was servant. And just a few characters off was one slave. Jesus didn't call us to be slaves. He called us to be servants. So similar, but so different. Jesus called us to serve others as an effort of love, not as an effort of obligation. We talked a little bit about that this morning in the learning hour. All that we are called to do in this world and certainly in the next is servanthood, not out of obligation, but out of love.
Yes.
When I think of servanthood, when I think of love, I think of Mother Teresa. She served the poor in Calcutta, India. And when she died in 2002, 11 million people stopped what they were doing, stopped their daily routine, stopped the things that they were about to show respect, to pay a tribute to this devoted woman, devoted to service. Now, it's been said that the sermons that she gave were not unusually outstanding, not delivered so well, but her sermons, best understood, were portrayed in her life of love, her life of service. Because what she called for from herself first and others next was a transformation of their lives and a conversion of their hearts. Do you know what you're asking? Did the disciples know what they were asking? Jesus told them over and over again it was service over status. The kingdom they envisioned could not come about with Jesus and the sacrifice that they knew he was going to make. That part was correct. But they were thinking earthly kingship, and they were over-evaluating their position and their prestige. They weren't putting service first. They were putting status above. When I think of secular sacrifice and secular experiences and role models, I think sometimes of the founder of Wendy's, Dave Thomas. Everybody knows that name. I would be willing to offer that if you saw a picture of Dave, you would recognize his photograph. Not because he was famous for starting a hamburger chain that lived beyond his own life, but because of how he built it. What a remarkable man. He was adopted as a child. He never finished high school. He spoke of achieving his MBA before he received his GED. You see, the pictures of Dave are very seldom of him in a suit, but more in an apron. MBA was not a master's of business administration. To Dave, it was mop bucket attitude, a commitment to service. That's what Jesus was teaching the disciples. Serve others. In that, Dave's professor could have been Jesus. And he would have been one of the few disciples that actually got it, actually saw the big picture. And that big picture lives on even beyond him. There is a book called The Family Story Bible, written by Ralph Milton, where he imagines a conversation between the Apostle Peter and Jesus. Listen to these words. "It doesn't make sense," Peter said. "What's wrong, Peter?" Jesus responded. "You spent 2 hours playing with that kid. You could have been talking to a whole bunch of people. How are people going to know that you are the Messiah? You should have been making speeches." And Jesus replied, "You can't love a crowd. You have to love people one by one." And so goes the message. And it all comes back to the two commands that Jesus said were the most important. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul. And the second is like that. Love your neighbor as yourself. It all comes back to loving others. So focus on them as you would focus on yourself if you were of the world and not just in the world. And it all goes back to that question. When you said, "I want to be a disciple in and for the kingdom," did you really know what you were asking? And all the children said,
Amen.
Amen.